Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bauby, translated from French by Jeremy Lissault, and published in 1997 by Alfred A. Knopf. It's 134 pages long. Jean-Dominique Bauby was a French journalist and editor. He was the cultural editor of the Paris Match news magazine and later became the general editor of the French fashion magazine Elle. His life changed dramatically a few weeks before Christmas in 1995. He was driving his son to a theater to watch a play when he suffered a massive stroke, which destroyed much of his brainstem. He was able to stop the car, stagger out, and collapsed. When he came to 2.5 weeks later, he was completely paralyzed. He could blink his left eye, swivel his neck slightly, and move his tongue a little bit in his mouth, and that was it. He was suffering from what's known as locked-in syndrome. This is a condition where your body is paralyzed, but your brain otherwise is unaffected. Your mind is still active. You can still think, but your body itself is paralyzed. So you're basically a prisoner inside your own body. Now, Bauby, after he was stabilized, was sent to a hospital on the French coast at the Pas de Calais, across the English Channel from Dover. And he was stayed at a hospital that was actually just very close to the beach. And on the hospital grounds, there was a lighthouse, which explains the lighthouse on the cover of the American edition of this book. He was staying in a town that was basically a tourist town, but they had this hospital that was built in the early 20th century to treat people with tuberculosis, and now it had become a hospital basically for long-term care patients. And Bauby spent the rest of his life staying in this hospital. Now, he eventually learned how to communicate using his left eye, using an eye blink method. A speech pathologist held up a board that had the letters of the alphabet arranged in usage, the most used letters in French appearing first, and she would point to each letter, and he would blink his left eye when she pointed to the letter that he wanted to select, and then she would write that letter down and start over. And so this very laborious, time-consuming method allowed him to communicate with other people, and that's the only way he could communicate. And of course, he was a writer and an editor, so this must have been incredibly frustrating for him. Eventually, his publisher sent an assistant to him, and he dictated this book entirely by blinking his eye. It took 2 months, working 7 days a week. He later estimated that completing the book required about 20,000 eye blinks. The book is made up of short little vignettes, some of which are about his condition in the hospital and his struggles with locked-in syndrome. That's the diving bell part of the book. The other parts of the book talk about his life before he had a stroke and his various dreams and fantasies where he can move around. That's the butterfly part, right? Because if you're in a diving bell, your movement is restricted. Butterflies can fly anywhere they want to go. You might think that this was an incredibly depressing book, but it's not. Bauby he was basically a stoic. He was taking what happened to him and handling it as well as he could. There's many parts of the book that are actually very inspiring and life-affirming. One of the most touching scenes is the Father's Day chapter. In the past, none of his family had really celebrated Father's Day. And he had broken up with his long-term girlfriend. He'd been in a relationship with this woman for 10 years, and shortly before his stroke, he'd broken up with her. She was the mother of his 2 children. He had a young daughter and son. They come from Paris to the Pas de Calais for Father's Day, and they go out onto this patio, which opens up on a beach, and he's watching his kids. His daughter starts doing cartwheels and acrobatic stuff, and he's incredibly proud of her. And he's touched by the fact that they're together briefly. Then they leave, and he becomes really sad when they're gone, because he knows that he's never going to be the father that he was before. There's also a lot of irony, several ironic scenes in this little book, 2 of which I'll talk to you about. One of which, a few days before his stroke, he goes and visits his 93-year-old father. His father lives on the fourth floor of an apartment building that doesn't have an elevator, and he's so old and feeble now that he can't go down the stairs or up the stairs, so he's basically trapped in his apartment. And so Bauby comes to visit him, and he decides that his father needs a shave. His father's too weak to shave himself, and so Bauby shaves his father. And then, of course, a few months later, everything is flipped. Now someone has to shave Bauby because he's paralyzed. And like his father, he's trapped in a room. He can't leave his hospital, and his father can't either. His father does call him periodically, but of course, Bauby can't respond because he can't speak anymore. Another irony is shortly before his stroke, Bauby finished rereading The Count of Monte Cristo, the great adventure novel by Alexandre Dumas. And one of the characters in The Count of Monte Cristo is Noirtier de Villefort, who is a character who has a stroke and becomes paralyzed, just like Bauby was. And as Bauby points out, this is the de Villefort character is the only major character in any fiction in the world that has this condition, and he happened to read that book shortly before this happened to him. The book concludes with an account of his last day before his stroke. How he had no idea what was going to happen. He was out testing a BMW car. He was going to write a review for it for his magazine. He goes, picks up his son to go to this play, and then the stroke happens. And the book ends with it's September. Summer's over. The leaves are changing. The weather's starting to change, and he's outside near the beach watching the seasons change, and he's thinking about the change in his life that's occurred since he's had this stroke, and he ends with an optimistic note. He thinks that he can continue developing. At the end of the book, he's able to make a few sounds. He's able to kind of grunt a melody of a children's French nursery song. So he's starting to be able to vocalize a little bit, but not really say words. And so the book ends with kind of an upbeat, optimistic viewpoint. He realizes he's never going to be able to walk again. He's always going to be paralyzed, but maybe he can develop. And he takes to imagining his life. He thinks of one of the few places he hadn't gone to was Hong Kong. There's a chapter where he imagines what it would be like to walk the streets of Hong Kong and visit with people and see some of the young women who hang out there. He remembers back when he was younger, and he and a friend went to a racetrack and got so caught up in a discussion that they failed to place a bet on the horse they went there to bet on. So there are chapters that refer to his imagination, how he's able to still live a full life in his imagination, even though he's cut off and stuck in this hospital. Probably the most depressing or sad chapter is the chapter about Sundays, because on Sundays the hospital empties out. There's no visitors. The nurses that show up are hungover from partying and drinking the night before, and he's just incredibly lonely because there's no interaction with other people on Sundays. Sundays are really, really hard for him to get through, and that, I think a lot of people can relate to that. There's many people who dread Sundays if they're living alone because of the lack of interaction there. Anyway, this is one of the few books that I reread periodically because every once in a while when I'm feeling sorry for myself or I start feeling self-pity, I go and pull this book out of the bookshelf and I read a couple of short chapters and I remind myself that I shouldn't be feeling sorry for myself. I'm able to talk. I'm able to walk around. I'm able to do all kinds of things that I don't even take time to be grateful for, and he couldn't do the simplest things. He couldn't tie shoes. He couldn't walk. He couldn't talk. He was completely at the mercy of other people. By the way, he mentions that most of the nurses in this hospital are very kind to him. There's a few, they're not mean, but they're just indifferent. One of the things that drives him nuts is when people change the channel of the TV to some channel he doesn't want to watch, and he can't tell them not to. There's one scene which is one of the funnier scenes in the book, where he's watching a soccer match, and it's late at night, and a nurse comes in, turns the TV off, turns off lights, and says good night, and leaves. And he's blinking frantically, trying to tell her to turn the TV back on, but of course she doesn't know what he's saying. So it's a book that reminds me of how fortunate I am. And even when I'm feeling sad or kind of feeling self-pity, I realize that this guy had it much worse, and yet he ended his life with great optimism and belief in the future. When this book came out in March of 1997, it was an immediate bestseller in France. It later became one of the most popular books in Europe. But unfortunately, Bauby did not live long enough to see that happen. 2 days before the book, or 2 days after the book came out, 2 days after it was published in March of 1997, he developed pneumonia and died suddenly. He was 44 years old, and he left behind 2 young children. The book is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. The author is Jean-Dominique Bauby. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.